Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm back with another video, and I haven't done one in this kind of setting for quite a while, but there has been quite a bit going on here in Ukraine. So I just wanted to kind of do a video to bring everybody up to speed, to kind of look at all the different pieces of the puzzle I see coming together, and really to kind of go beyond the headlines. Look at the issues and the situation beyond just the carefully crafted headlines that are written to push narratives and people's visceral knee-jerk reaction to those headlines. So that's the whole point of me wanting to kind of do this video today. So as this isn't one of my normal travel videos, this is one of my more analytical videos where I look at what's going on in Ukraine. I will go ahead and reintroduce myself for those of you who may be finding my channel for the first time, and if you are, welcome. So a little bit about my background. I'm a former Army intelligence officer of over 23 years, specializing in Russia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Bulk of my time I worked at the strategic level, so I didn't do so much tactical, which is why you don't see me do a lot of these videos where I read the headlines and then I'll go out to Funker someplace and pull in a video of a drone flying into Russian units and then play that and like, wow, that's so cool. Yeah, that stuff makes good content. It's fun to watch, but it really doesn't give you the overall picture of what's going on the battlefield. And just in Ukraine at large. So that's why I kind of stay away from that. I try to look at everything from like the 1,000-meter stare. And whenever I look at anything strategically, unlike tactically, strategically, I kind of look at the secondary and tertiary effects and cause and effects as well. So it's a little bit about me. Like I said, I was focusing on Ukraine for the bulk of my career. Moved here in 2019 to do my third master's degree at Shevchenko University. I've just stayed and been here ever since. I did have the opportunity, though I still do some things with the government on kind of a liaison basis. So in 2023, I was the European Combatant Command, UCOM's Ukrainian SME, subject matter expert, liaison officer to SAGU, Security Assistance Group Ukraine, which is a 3-star led command in Wiesbaden, Germany. So I was the 4 stars liaison officer to the 3-star. And so I was, really hands-on talking to the Ukrainians there in Wiesbaden. We were making video conferences and video calls 3 times a daily to the commanders on the front line. So really, had my hands or my fingers in the middle of the pie, fingers in the pie, I guess you would say. So I haven't always just been, observing from afar. I've kind of been in the mix as well since I've been here. So the whole point of me telling you about this is to tell you that it is my professional opinion that I do not see a military solution to this current conflict in Ukraine. And the reason I'm saying that is, while my knee-jerk reaction is the same as everybody else, yes, go ahead and flood Ukraine with weapons, and I hope they do, by the way. I don't think that's going to be enough for Ukraine to actually defeat Russia on the battlefield. Now, let me clarify what I'm saying. I'm not saying Ukraine is going to lose. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying I don't think it has the manpower and the capabilities to actually mount large-scale offensives at the maybe division, corps, or even combined arms army level that it would take to push forward to recover large swaths of regain large swaths of its territory. Conversely, I don't think Russia can do that either. So they can't mount enough forces to push through Ukraine defenses and take large swaths of land in Ukraine either. In fact, the incremental gains they're making are coming at such a high cost that no Western commander would ever, sacrifice soldiers. I want to say men, but I guess say men and women, sacrifice soldiers for those small amount of incremental gains. Russia doesn't follow the same doctrine the West does. They don't really care about loss of life, and so they will continue to throw people in what's known as the meat grinder for basically minute gains that really don't strategically mean anything on the battlefield. So that's kind of where we're to stand today. Now, when I say there's no military solution, it's because it's a historical fact that all conflicts end in a settled negotiation of some sort. And so when you look at 2 armies, when they come together and fight, usually victory occurs when one side has capitulated either economically or militarily. So right now, both sides still have the manpower and equipment to fight. They still have the economic means to fight. And so both sides will continue to fight with neither one being able to gain really the upper hand, like the strategic level upper hand on the battlefield. So despite the front line moving back and forth incrementally, we have almost fought to what's known as a stalemate, just because neither side can really gain the upper hand, enough of an upper hand to give itself, a decisive victory on the battlefield. So I want to tell you a little bit about me and a little bit about why I think the way I do. And so to kind of get where we are, so when I was in the military, every year we'd have a big exercise. When I was working for UCOM, this is the Combatant Command, we had our huge Combatant Command exercise every year. And if it lasted for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or whatever, you were always sent this read ahead material. It's called Road to War. And it was, you read through this and it gave you the historical background, the political background, and basically everything that happened up until when the scenario and the exercise was supposed to start. It was the road to war, like how we got where we were. So I kind of want to do an ad hoc, real quick, road to war on how we got where we are, but I'm going to start at the beginning of this year, basically when President Trump took office. Because these last 4 months and where I see going from now are, I think, a pretty crucial to the current situation as it stands. So everybody knows during President Trump's presidential campaign, he promised to end the war in 24 hours. So this is going to be one of the only times I actually pause during my road to war, just to tell you, if you actually believe that, there's nothing I'm going to say in this video that's going to convince you otherwise. But if you actually understood, even if you believe, he was the Putin's best friend, and he gets elected, and Putin calls like, "Hey Donnie, congratulations, thanks Vlad, appreciate it, glad to be back. By the way, could you end the war?" "Yeah, sure, let me go ahead and call that off." Even if that were to happen in some strange mythical universe, knowing how the C2 command and control structure works in the Russian military, and understanding how long it takes to get a directive from the top all the way down to the front line, because I can tell you, way down at the tactical level, and I mean even below battalion, so company and probably a platoon, and even out front of the platoons, these little 2 and 4 man assault teams, a lot of these forward tactical, lower level tactical units do not have commo. They don't have comms. So they actually have runners go back out. So as where I have seen a directive go from the top down, it could take 24, 48, 36 hours before it actually reaches all the way down to the bottom of the front line. So if you understand how that works, you understand there's no way possible this was going to be a 24-hour turnaround. Everything is a conspiracy theory unless you know how things work. So I did not believe for a fraction of a second that Trump could end this war in 24 hours. What I took that to mean is he was going to try. He was going to put an effort in and actually, try to end the war. This was good news for me because looking at this doctrinally, even in the military, and our U.S. government is patterned kind of after the military a little bit, I'll explain. So even in the military, at the lower tactical levels, just say you're at a battalion or even a company level, and you receive an operational order, an op order, at the very top is your commander's intent. That way, you know what you need to do to execute the mission to meet the commander's intent at the end. On the bigger scale, that's called a strategic end state. Throughout the Biden administration, although I am extremely thankful for the weapons the Biden administration provided Ukraine, the Biden administration never named a strategic end state. The two things that always said were until the end and as long as it takes. So until the end, my question was, and what does that look like? And as long as it takes, and as long as what takes. If you don't have a strategic end or a strategic end state, you cannot backwards plan your operations in order to meet that end state because you don't know what you're trying to meet. And there's no way you can enter into negotiations because what are you negotiating for if you don't have an end state? So President Trump, one of the first things he said during his campaign trail is he wants to end the conflict. That is a strategic end state. Now, a lot of people will come back and say, Trump has no plan. Fair enough. But just like in the military, he does not have to have a plan. Military commanders don't make their plans. They put out a strategic end state. This is my goal. This is what I want. And then their planning and operation teams are the one that come up with the plans and execute them in order to meet the commander's intent. Same thing here. He has, his negotiators. He has the behind the scenes advisors and people that we'll never know about, doing all these things, trying to create and execute a plan in order to meet President Trump's goal of the strategic end state of ending the war. And from what I'm kind of seeing play out, that and logically, that starts with a ceasefire, because a ceasefire needs to take place prior to any negotiations taking place. He has proposed an unconditional ceasefire for 30 days. Immediately, Ukraine said, yes, we are going to, we're on board with that. So we agree to this ceasefire, and now Putin is trying to negotiate conditions for the ceasefire to start negotiations. So, there's not supposed to be any negotiations for the ceasefire, because the ceasefire takes place, then negotiations can start. Putin doesn't see that way. That's not how Russia works. They're wanting to use conditions for the ceasefire to advance their prerogative and their priorities. So you can see that the Western mindset is a little different than the Russian mindset, even when talking about a ceasefire, just to get to the table to start negotiations. So, I won't spend a whole lot of time going back and talking about. We remember the flare-up in the Oval Office between President Trump and J.D. Vance and President Zelensky. Horrible situation that ended up with a cessation of military aid for a short term, plus a cessation of sharing of intelligence between the U.S. and Ukraine, which did cause a lot of problems, especially in the Kursk region, and it is one of the main catalysts for Ukraine losing its foothold that it had in Kursk. The initial minerals deal that was proposed was absolutely preposterous. President Zelensky and no leader in their right mind would have signed that deal. And I don't honestly think that deal was ever made to be signed in the first place, because if you ever look at how President Trump does his business negotiations as a businessman, he would just throw this ridiculous, offer out there and force people to come back and counteroffer. If you don't want to commit a whole lot of time, money, and resources, that's kind of smart, because why do you want to have all these people just spend all this time and resources and money crafting these deals? And then if the other side is going to come back to counteroffer anyway, just throw something over the top that doesn't take a whole lot of time to string together. Let them come back to the counteroffer, and then that's where negotiations will begin. So what ended up happening is they end up signing the mineral deal with Ukraine. President Trump reinstated intelligence sharing and weapons, and I want to look a little bit about this. This minerals deal that was signed. So this is from the Center for Strategic International Studies, you can see here, and there are a couple of pretty important things here. One, this little line here, it says basically that originally the deal called for Ukraine to repay $500 billion. So the new minerals deal that was signed has taken out any language in repayment for prior military assistance given from the U.S. to Ukraine, which is really good. And then the other thing it says here. So it says that any future, military assistance, be in the way of ammunition, weapon systems, training, or capital, as a capital contribution to the fund. What that is basically saying is any future military aid, messing with my transition buttons, any future military aid that the U.S. gives Ukraine will be considered a contribution to this fund as well. This is kind of a backdoor way to allow the U.S. to continue with military aid after the current package runs out that was put in place by the Biden administration, which will take Ukraine through the summer as far as weapon supplies, munitions for their platforms, and maintenance material as well. So this is a way for, after that runs out, for the Trump administration to continue providing military aid as kind of a backdoor way and an easy way to sell it to his base. But you also have to understand there are a couple of other ways that the U.S. can continue supplying this as well. And I'll get into that just a little bit later in the video here. My transition screen seems not to want to work anymore. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So we got the deal signed. The new deal is a pretty good deal. It is, instead of a 5-person board of trustees, or whatever you want to call it, board of governors, instead of 3 U.S. and 2 Ukrainian. It's 2-2 now. Ukraine has first say on who they get to sell these rights to, and a lot of other things. So the defense minister, the finance minister of Ukraine, President Zelensky of Ukraine, multiple members of parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, have all said this is a very good deal for Ukraine in the end. So the deal was signed. President Trump met Zelensky at the Vatican, and then later J.D. Vance at the Vatican, Vice President J.D. Vance at the Vatican. They seem to healed or mended old wounds for the most part. Everything seemed to kind of be turning a corner. And then around the 24th of April, there was a large missile strike and drone strike on Kyiv and all across Ukraine. President Trump, took to social media, says, Vlad, don't, and said, he talked about doing some sanctions, and the coalition of the willing leaders met in Kyiv. They were ready to impose sanctions unless Russia signed a ceasefire negotiation. Putin came back, countered with, well, let's meet for direct negotiations in Turkey. Trump backed off sanctions. The European leaders went ahead and imposed some of their sanctions or unilateral sanctions. And then Russia sent kind of a low-level group of delegates, and it didn't really amount to anything. That series of meetings didn't, except for the fact they did agree to trade a 1-for-1, 1,000 prisoner swaps, which is good. Side note on that, none of the original Azov fighters that defended Azovstal in Mariupol in 2022 were part of that, so they still remain political prisoners. Russia is really bad about not releasing any of the Azovstal members because of political persecution. So last weekend, we'll fast forward a little bit. Last weekend, there was another huge missile attack Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 3 nights in a row. Missiles, drones, the largest since the war started. Pissed Trump off. He said as much. I'm angry. He took to social media, said quite a few things. In fact, some of the things he said now are actually kind of important. He said he doesn't like what Putin is doing at all. He has went crazy. He said if it wasn't for him, a lot of bad things would have happened to Russia, and I mean a lot of bad things. And then yesterday he was, I'm doing this video on Thursday. So yesterday, Wednesday, he was asked by a reporter again, and he said, I don't like him firing rockets. And by the way, whenever he says rockets, he means missiles. I don't like him firing rockets at cities, and we're not going to allow it. That was pretty significant statement for me, whether he said it in passing or actually meant it. I will tell you that, they took place Friday night to Saturday morning. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday into Monday morning. Those were the last times we really had any large-scale strikes here, especially in Kyiv. On Tuesday, got a warning on one of our channels that 6 different Tu-95 bombers had arrived at Angles Airfield. They had loaded them. Russia had been flying the IL-76 Ilyushin, the big spy plane, basically. It had been several of those had been flying routes almost like they were doing reconnaissance, and then they had loaded up all these Tu-95 bombers with ballistic missiles. And I thought Tuesday night, oh boy, here we go. It's going to be on now. But nothing happened. And so I'm thinking Russia thinks maybe it overplayed its hand a little bit, got a little too aggressive, and Trump got pretty angry. And so it's been really kind of quiet since then. So now I want to go into, so this is kind of where we are now, and I want to go into some of these pieces I see of the puzzle all coming together. So despite my video title, do I think President Trump is this master strategist playing 4D chess? No, I'm not one of these 4D chess bros that thinks Trump is, like I said, a master strategist, and he is out, strategizing everybody, and he's the only one that knows what's going on. I do think President Trump is a puzzle piece in a larger puzzle, obviously, and I'm starting to see a lot of these pieces come together now. So why hasn't President Trump imposed any sanctions yet? Let's talk about that. As I said at the beginning of this video, all conflicts end in negotiation, and so President Trump wants to play interocular, or at least a mediator. He wants to be a mediator. In order to do that, you have to be neutral, or at least remain neutral. Give the appearance of remaining neutral. So if President Trump were to, and this is frustrating for me as well, because I automatically want President Trump to be on Ukraine's side. I want him to, give everything to Ukraine. I want him to impose crushing sanctions on Russia. I want him to give Ukraine all the weapons they need, and just like anybody else who supports Ukraine does. The problem is, as soon as President Trump gives the appearance even that he's on Ukraine's side and he's not neutral, Russia will run away from any potential negotiations. And understandably so. If you were in Russia's position, would you want to sit down with the U.S. and Zelensky if you thought the U.S. President Trump had Ukraine's back? Probably not. So, unfortunately, I think this is one of the big reasons that President Trump hasn't imposed sanctions. Another reason I think this is kind of the route it's going down. Everybody watching this video will tell you, whether you support President Trump or you don't support President Trump, that the man is, I guess you could classify maybe narcissist or at least a little thin-skinned. You see him, if anybody says anything that makes him angry, he will blow up on social media and attack them back. President Trump, it's well known, President Trump is all over social media and the internet. He goes out there and he reads things. And there are so many international news outlets. There are so many people in the Democrat Party and even some people in the Republican Party who are saying how extremely weak he is looking towards Putin. And he's not really reacting to it. And that almost makes me think that some of his inside advisors are telling him, look, if you want to play the part of mediator, you have to remain neutral. You're probably going to take some flack over this, not imposing sanctions, but you're just going to have to ignore it. I like to think, being a little optimistic, I like to think maybe that's why he's not reacting to this and why he's not imposing sanctions. Speaking of imposing sanctions, two of the things, however, I want to point out here, since a lot of people are frustrated, say Trump's not doing anything to move this forward. I think it's important to note that not only is that backdoor clause in the mineral deal to be able to supply weapons to Ukraine, I think it's important to note two other things. President Trump has not removed any sanctions on Russia imposed by President Biden. He very well could have. Yes, there's been talk of lifting sanctions as a kind of a carrot in order to bring Russia to the table, but he hasn't done that at all. The other thing I think is important is he has not paused, except for a couple of temporary pauses, he has not paused the rest of the military aid that was approved by Congress last year under the Biden administration. Under his authorities as commander-in-chief, he very well could do that simply with one phone call, but he hasn't done it. So I think those are two things of important note. One of the other things I want to put out, his other safety nets is, and I'm going to have to switch back over to my other screen here. So one of his other safety nets is Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal currently are sponsoring a bill in the Senate, and I'm sure you've probably heard about this. So this bill, it's like they call it the Sanction Russia bill, but funny enough, it's secondary sanctions. So it sanctions it's secondary sanctions on other countries who are buying, gas, uranium, oil, and other products from Russia. So this is a secondary sanction against countries who are buying these things, and it will impose a 500% tariff on any goods from these countries that are, coming to the U.S. So this is kind of a backdoor way to impose sanctions on Russia, while at the same time still allowing President Trump to extend that olive branch in order to try to get Russia to the negotiating table. I think as the EU just imposed its 17th sanction package. They're already working on their 18th, which are supposed to be a lot more aggressive. You have Senator Blumenthal and Graham's heavy sanctions bill looming in Congress. You have reports of food shortage in the country. Russia's running out of potatoes, trying to beg Belarus. Serious economic problems because the sanctions are biting eventually. Russia's not able to produce as many modern weapons platforms as they had, so they're digging a lot of the old Soviet stockpile out. Their um, their ratio of losses per square meter gained is not sustainable, or square kilometer gain is not sustainable. So as I see all these things kind of closing in on Russia, all these walls closing in, Putin's kind of being backed into a corner. And if you back a dog into a corner, a rabid dog, they'll bite, right? So here's where President Trump can still kind of hold his hand out and say, hey, all this stuff's coming down the pipe, but we can still come to the negotiation table, because unfortunately, like I said, that's the only way this conflict is going to end. Now let's talk about this Graham and Blumenthal's sanction package. Now, right off the bat, I say, yeah, hit them with this sanction package. It's going to cripple Russia. It's going to, basically, hopefully, back India and China off of buying any of their petroleum products. But then again, we have to look at secondary and tertiary effects. We hope China would be logical about this and have a logical response to this. We would hope that by imposing 500% tariffs on Russia, and the U.S. and EU being on China, and the EU being and U.S. being China's largest trading partners, they wouldn't see the benefit of sticking with Russia and buying this cheap gas and oil from Russia, because they wouldn't want to lose their largest trading market, because that's a huge chunk of their GDP. Trade with Russia only makes up about 10% of China's GDP. So they would be basically shunning their two largest customers in favor of one of their smallest customers. Now you would think this logically, they would think this. However, what if China approaches this ideologically instead? Says, well, we have this pact with Russia, and we don't want to break that in favor of the U.S. So that's some of the thing that the planners are spinning through and wargaming all this. The other thing that I think is one of the big hindrances of imposing this sanctions bill right now is, if you read it, it says any country who's buying Russian gas, oil, uranium, anything. Well, as last I checked, Hungary, Italy, Czechia, and Slovakia were all still purchasing Russian gas and oil. And there is no exceptions clause in this bill. Therefore, our partner countries in the EU and NATO would also be hit with this. And so I think the U.S. would take a huge political hit for that. So while European leaders are sitting there, screaming, hey, go ahead and push this sanctions bill through, those same European leaders will be yelling on the backside that, we just impose these huge tariffs on, members, EU and NATO members as well. Kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. So I think there's probably some discussion about, and I think part of that sanctions package is targeted towards EU also, to help encourage them to wean themselves off of gas and Russian gas and oil. EU currently has a plan to be completely independent from Russian gas and oil, but not until 2027. EU and the NATO countries are kind of hypocrites, because in 2024, while they're screaming about, they're having all these contract group meetings and the coalition of the willing, and they're bringing all these people together to try to stop Russia, it bought 22 billion euro worth of Russian gas and oil products, while simultaneously only giving Ukraine about 19 billion in military aid. So like I said, it's kind of a catch-22 there. So why did I want to do this video? I want to do this video to kind of get out from behind the headlines. I do have some experience in international negotiations, certainly not at the level of president, but some pretty high-level international negotiations. I do know that probably, I would say 80 to 90% of the negotiations take place in what's called back-channel discussions or behind closed doors, and they're never released publicly. Usually the public readouts are for domestic messaging only, which is why you see different readouts, like between Russia and the U.S. What the Russian readout might read a little different. That's because that's their readout to the Russian people. And so we unfortunately will never be privy to these back channel discussions. And so we only have to rely on what the readouts say and what they say to the media, which I can tell you from experience aren't always in sync. So I think everything is starting to come to a head now. as we say in the States. I think the walls are closing in on Putin. Trump has now said he has about a 1.5 or 2 week window before they start doing things different. I think there is a lot of pressure building up from within the Republican Party on President Trump to do something. I already know for a fact that EU leaders are pressuring President Trump to do something. And so hopefully, this thing will be brought to a resolution in the near term. And like I said, I think that's going to be through negotiations, or if Putin does not want to negotiate, then stronger sanctions will foment an economic collapse in Russia. And then that's pretty scary too. And I think that is one of the other things that, secondary and tertiary effects that the strategists behind the world leaders, Western world leaders, are trying to war game right now to see what are the cause and effects going to be if they do impose these. So I'll tell you, if Putin were to vacate the presidency by either voluntarily or involuntarily, the Russian Constitution states that there has to be elections in 90 days. Meanwhile, the Russian Prime Minister takes over. I forget his name. Interesting character. He doesn't really speak out a lot. He hasn't really spoke out a lot about in support for the war. He hasn't spoke out a lot in against the war. So it's very he'd be an interesting person. However, I've read a bunch of intelligence estimates as well on what they think would happen, and most likely Russia would plunge into civil war during those 90 days with probably an attempted military coup, oligarchs trying to off their competition in order to vie for power, and then God forbid somebody like Medvedev would get back in. The former prime minister and former president, who is now head of Putin's United Russia Party and one of the main members of the upper house of the Russian Duma. God forbid he would get back in, because he constantly talks about, he's widely known for being an alcoholic, and he constantly talks about dropping nuclear bombs on France and Germany. So hopefully he doesn't get back in. But that's one of the things you have to look at. If they impose these crushing sanctions and Russia's economy collapses, Putin is probably not going to be around to collect his retirement check. So, and then they have to look at what happens. And the assessment up until now has always been, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So that could be a chance to help foster new relations with a new Russia, a more democratic and free Russia. It could end up meaning a fractured Russia where warlords control different territories, and unfortunately may also have their hands on nuclear weapons as well. So, like I said, while it's easy for people to just do emotional knee-jerk reactions to the headlines, you always have to think about this, going forward, secondary and tertiary effects. But I do think this is all coming to a head. I think we're going to probably in the next, I would say 90 days to 6 months, at least be in the middle of serious negotiations at that point, or Russia is going to really, really be headed towards an economic collapse at that point. So like I said, I think we would see probably within the next, at that point, I would say 6 months to 9 months to some type of resolution for what it's worth. And so even if that might just be an armistice, just like in North Korea, until the parties can calm down enough to get together enough to start actual long-term negotiations. So that's it. Just want to kind of do a video like this, peel back the layers, get out from the headlines, get away from emotional reactions. So if you'd like to see some more of this type of content, let me know. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.